Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to be live streaming this on Facebook. So we're going to give it just a second to click over, make sure we have everybody. We're going to let everybody in. We have about 500 people registered. So incredible. Woo-hoo. Yeah. Please introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from, and maybe where you work, because a lot of people are very connected to this, as we will talk about tonight. All right, we've got 120 people in here. We're just going to let people log in a little bit more. All right. Hi, Carol. Lots of people from CACs. Incredible. Hi, Debbie. Debbie from Bermuda. Beloved Debbie. It's so great to see you all here. Lots of people from North Carolina and Tennessee. Amazing. Thank you so much to each of you. I know if you're on the East Coast, this is dinner time. If you're on the West Coast, you are ready for the day to end, but you are here with us. And we are so excited to have you join us for the first of 3-part conversation with award-winning author Stephen Mills. And so I would like to introduce Darkness to Light. We are the host organization, although we're bringing in some experts in our community to talk in each of these 3 parts. But we are an organization that focuses specifically on the prevention of child sexual abuse through adult education. And that could either be at the parent level, at the community organization level, or at the advocacy and political level. We do consulting in communities, particularly communities like the ones Stephen and Andrea are going to talk about tonight. And so we're so excited to talk about not only a piece of art and a person's lived experience, but unfortunately prime example of the way of the organizations that Darkness to Light likes to work with. And so many of you have joined us with Honest Conversations before. This is a little bit of a different vibe. We are launching a series called Honoring Their Voices, and it's a brand new virtual series with the goal of amplifying the voices of survivors and others with lived experience of child sexual abuse so that we can engage in real life conversations about things that have happened without academia and without evidence-based reading a new research paper. These are things that have happened in people's lives. And so we really want to make sure that everyone has the chance to be able to engage in our new series. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. All participants are muted. If you have any questions, please use this Q&A feature on Zoom. The questions get lost in the chat, so stick to that conversation. But if you have any questions for the panel today, we want to make sure you put that in the Q&A. Like I've said before, the chat is for networking and comments. Introduce yourself, what you do, why you're here tonight. But also know that you're going to hear some things tonight that might be triggering and upsetting, and we understand that, and it's a safe place. So if you need to talk to someone, you can. There's 2 options, both are free. You can either call the number 866-4LIGHT, that's FORLIGHT, or you can text the word LIGHT to 741-741. And in both cases, you'll be connected with a licensed counselor. This video will be available on our Facebook and our YouTube channels after the event ends. We do translate all of this into Spanish as well. It takes about 2 weeks. You'll see both of those, the English and the Spanish version, up in about 2 weeks. And finally, I'm going to ask each and every one of you to please remain respectful at all times. Even if you disagree with someone, they might be going through something. And so politeness is the name of the game here. We will remove harmful comments or inappropriate comments. So again, please remain respectful. And we ask that you keep an open mind and that you are here to learn and to talk and to dialogue. And so we're excited to do that in partnership with you. So again, we're here at our first Honoring Their Voices conversation with Stephen Mills, and this will occur over 3 parts. And tonight we begin with part 1, where we'll talk in more depth about issues surrounding grooming and manipulation in relationship to child sexual abuse. I am joined this evening, as you can see, by author Stephen Mills and Andrea Harner, who is a forensic interviewer at a child advocacy center in California, and also has the pleasure of sitting on the board of directors of Darkness to Light. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Thank you, Caitlin. You do such fantastic work. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. In Predation, which is the first part of your book, Stephen Chosen, A Memoir of Stolen Boyhood, you narrate many types of loss from your point of view as a child: the loss of innocence, the loss of trust, bodily autonomy, as well as the loss of your father, which made you and your whole family particularly vulnerable to grooming and manipulation. So Stephen, I know people on here have read the book, but we want to hear from you. Set the stage for us and tell us more about why you were chosen and what happened.
Sure. And you know what, before I do that, I just thought I'd start by saying, just as sort of general framing for this discussion and the ones to follow, that, culturally, we push away this issue. I don't need to tell you two that because you deal with it every day. And, one of the ways that people tend to push it away is by thinking that it happens to other people and other families and those other communities over there, but not my community and certainly not my family. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion, because my hope is that my book, one thing that it conveys is just the complete ordinariness of my family and me as a kid, right? And in my mind, still to this day, if it could happen to me in that family, it can happen to any family, anywhere in any community. So I just wanted to say that, and then, move into who I was at 12 years old. And I thought I'd start that by asking Tracy to show a photo of me and my mother and stepfather. There we are. That's me at 12. This is actually the day of my bar mitzvah. Raised Jewish, and the bar mitzvah accounts for my mother's amazing hat and for my cufflinks. That was the last time in my life I ever wore cufflinks. And, we were a solidly middle-class family. My mother was the office manager for a social services agency on Long Island in New York. My stepfather owned a dry cleaning store where I started working when I was 10 years old. And very sort of typical working class, middle class Jewish family of the time. This would be 1968 when this photo was taken. And, I would have to say I was a pretty typical, kid of that cohort. I was good in school, a little bit brainy, very into reading, crazy about baseball and sports and Little League. Had a crush on a girl in my 7th grade class. And, that was life as I knew it. There were other things lurking in the background, including the nature of the step family. But interestingly, they didn't really explode until what ensued. And so 3 months after this photo was taken, I went off to Camp Eliphos in Connecticut, a Jewish sleepaway camp. It was the 3rd summer I'd gone there. But this summer, something entirely different happened. The director, a social worker named Dan Farinella, out of nowhere zeroed in on me and started paying a whole lot of attention to me. He screened a sex education film for the older boys' bunks, including mine, which seemed kind of strange. And at lunch that day, after the sex ed film, he came into the mess hall, tapped me on the shoulder, and took me outside and took me on a walk. And on that walk, I was, of course, to me, this was like God coming down to, take me away from my bunk and my friends, because I'd never spoken to Dan Farinella in my life, and I wouldn't have. It's like talking to the principal in your school when you're in seventh grade. You just do not do it. And he was the king of the kingdom, and very charismatic, very physically large, imposing, domineering, and a sort of combination of playful and intimidating, not just with kids, but with counselors. So he had a big personality, and he was everywhere. I mean, he was not an armchair kind of camp director. He knew everything about everyone. And on this walk, he started asking me about my family, and the nature of the family. He sussed out that my father had died when I was 4, that I was caught in the middle of kind of a family push and pull between my mother and my older stepbrother. I'd never had an adult ask me things like this before and want to know these things. And so it was this strange combination of discomfort, but also feeling incredibly special that an adult was interested and cared. And of course, I knew he was a social worker. We all knew that. And so this is his profession. And, that he also asked me in that first walk what I thought about masturbation. This, of course, came in the wake of that sex ed film. And of course, in hindsight, we know exactly what he was up to. But at the time, this seemed to me like, whoa, no adult had ever asked me anything like that. And I'd certainly never discussed it with any adult. In ensuing walks, because he made it his business to find me, pull me away from my bunk, take me on other walks, take me to his cabin for milk and cookies, we're going to one-on-one conversations. And, he probed deeper and deeper into who I was, my thoughts, my feelings, my world, and really turned himself into this kind of armchair therapist. I mean, I didn't really have that. I didn't think of it that way at the time, but he was sort of playing that role of adult who cared so much about me that he was going to find out and advise me on how I could handle, these problems in my family life. And that was, incredibly empowering. That's how it felt. And by the end of that month, we had this bond. I saw him as my friend, my ally, my protector. I mean, he was the head of camp, for God's sake. If this guy had my back, I was untouchable. And everyone knew he had my back, because he'd make a point, for example, of play fighting with me in public. So play fighting was one of his, very routine moves with boys, never with girls. And in fact, later, female counselors would tell me, this was decades later, that they always thought it was odd that they never, ever saw him talk to a girl camper. Never. And barely talk to female counselors, only if absolutely necessary. So the physical boundaries got, very quickly, today I would say violated, but at the time, of course, it was a combination of play fighting. And of course, that was tons of fun, because he was this huge guy who would let you beat the crap out of him and laugh, right? And there's nothing more fun for boys than being able to treat a large football-sized player adult as a punching bag, right? But it was combined with these sort of flashes of him exerting his physical power and domination. And there's one scene in the book where he goes, suckers me into shaking his hand and squeezes it so hard that I start crying because I really think he's breaking my hand. And, that was his MO. And this really intense blend of play and fun and inflicting physical pain and domination. So, the summer ended. I went home and didn't say a word about it to my mother or stepfather. And that fall, my mother gets a call. It's Dan Farinella asking her permission to, if I can go up to camp in the off season with him alone. Right. And that was really, for me, that was the moment of really feeling like I'd won some prize I didn't know existed. I mean, right. This was like, whoa, I didn't even know such a thing was possible. And I knew that he palled around with all sorts of boys in camp. And why was, the fact that he was choosing me was, it was like the greatest thing that had ever happened to me. So that, I guess the last thing I want to say about that is that, really one of the takeaways here is that, and I should say that weekend up at camp, 100 miles from home in the middle of the woods, is the first time he sexually assaulted me. So by the time the trap springs shut, the emotional bond was so deep. And that relationship, that what I saw as this friendship and him as protector, was so important, so central to me, that in the wake of it, all my mind could do was say over and over and over, that didn't happen, that didn't happen, that didn't happen. I so desperately wanted to return to what it had been before, right? When he was this great guy and he was my friend. And so, yeah, I'll leave it there, I think.
Incredibly powerful. I mean, it's no wonder reading your book is such a dream. Your way with words and the way that you create a picture and a story by recounting your experiences deeply moving. So Andrea, I'd love to, sort of talk about it from your point of view. You're a professional, you hear children disclose on a daily basis about their sexual abuse, et cetera. Does the Stephen story sound familiar? What are some of the patterns that happened to Stephen 40 years ago that you still see today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the truth is that predators want an easy target, right? And they're incredibly skilled at honing in on what kid would appreciate extra attention. What kid, I mean, in Stephen's case, right? Your dad, you were missing your dad lately.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't have a close connection with your mom.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, what better kind of place to situate himself and be, like you said, like your best friend, your confidant, your therapist. So sort of picking up on that vulnerability is huge. And, even more subtly, I mean, I can recall a number of cases. There's this one I can think of where I interviewed 2 9-year-old twin boys, and they were identical twins. And one of them, I interviewed both of them. We knew for sure, we were pretty certain that one of them had been sexually abused by mom's boyfriend. And the other one, we weren't sure if he was a witness, if he was also a victim. And it became pretty clear that the difference between these two was that the one who the one who did get sexually abused ultimately was the shyer, sort of meeker one of the two.
Mm-hmm.
And when the predator first did the boundary crossing, which was slapping their butts, the other brother just called him out. Like, what are you doing? Stop that. You know, whereas the other boy who was really sensitive and quiet and shy, he didn't say anything. And I think he was testing both of them, and he found out that, you know, this is the better target than the other one who's likely to say something, right?
And could I just jump in there 1 second, Andrea, with one which I maybe should have mentioned. You know,
Okay.
years later, when I tracked down other victims of Dan Farinella, I pieced together exactly how systematic he had been in screening boys. He had a whole system. I wasn't the only one he was taking on walks in the woods. He did that with virtually every 12 and 13-year-old boy. And he had a kind of funnel system, right? He would put everyone went in the top, and then he would gradually weed out the ones that he felt, you know, were going to give him blowback, or didn't have the kind of needs, you know, that I had. So anyway, to your point, it was incredibly systematic.
Absolutely. And then also, I think you bring up something that is so true, and I can't kind of overstate, is the complexity of that relationship.
Mhm.
Because if it's just the bad guy who comes and does this, you're just like, he's a bad guy, and you know, but it's the fact that he was also good to you and gay and fulfilled some of your needs, right? And
Absolutely.
you know, even at one point in a sort of stark example, he taught you how to fix a tire, right? And like, and
Mhm.
not to mention, he just listened to you and made you feel like you were special, and he understood you.
Mhm.
And your mom didn't understand you, right? Only he understood you, like isolating you from your relationships. But often I'll interview kids who say, I just couldn't believe this was really happening, because he also like bought me clothes and ice cream and was nice to me. But then he would also come into my bedroom at night and do this. Like, the cognitive dissonance is too great. And so that keeps kids, and this is sort of just one of the huge things about grooming, is it that confusion that it creates, which then becomes self-blame and shame and guilt, becomes the child feels complicit in their own victimization, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's what I would say.
You've talked a lot about trust between the individual who is the victim, and the individual who's grooming. What about the trust between, you know, the parent or the caregiver of the child? I mean, how does that? It it seems as if it's calculated to lower suspicion, basically, and to show that the abuser can be an asset to the family. And so, Ms. Stephen, let's start with you and talk a little bit about, and you go into detail, but how did Farinella groom your mom and stepdad, and how long do you feel like that went on for?
Right. You know, I think the most important thing to realize about serial predators working in, especially in an organizational setting, is that first and foremost, they're con artists. And by that, I mean, they understand exactly what their mark craves the most emotionally. And they go about providing what their mark craves the most. And that's how they build trust. And, you know, in my family's case, my mother, ironically enough, craved the approval of social workers. She worked in a social service agency. Her bosses were social workers. So here's this esteemed social worker, you know, coming to pick me up on the weekends, when on the off season, when he would pick me up after school and take me up to camp to sexually abuse me, sitting down in her living room and spending all sorts of time with her over coffee. And he'd be smoking and they'd both be drinking black coffee and talking to her about the social service issues that were most important to her, and how important her agency's work was, and how he was leading the charge in schools and in camps for a better world, a more just world. Remember, this is 1968. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had just been assassinated. They had this shared language of social good and social justice, and my mother just ate that up, just ate it up. And you know, that of course, she was the one up front because she was home. She'd be home from work by the time he picked me up. Later, my stepfather would get the same treatment. And I'd say over a year or 2 years, they were best of friends. My parents were inviting Farinella and his wife to the Jewish holidays at our house, which was a big extended family holiday dinner. And here are the Farinellas, the guy who's been sexually assaulting me for 2 years at our family's New Year's dinner. And the abuse ended after 2 years because, of course, I aged out. I didn't understand that at the time, but I aged out at 15. But they remained friends with him for 18 years. And it only ended when I was 30 and disclosed to them what had happened. That was the end. But until then, that was a very, what they thought, a close friendship. Of course, the whole thing was a complete sham. And later I would find out that he infiltrated other families in a similar way, including families of his own colleagues. So, he was quite, and this is the part of that kind of personality. I can't pretend to understand it, but when you're dealing with a sociopath, it's really hard to fathom how a human can do this. There's something missing there in terms of their empathy, right? To go into a colleague or someone's house and con them into handing over their child for their sexual pleasure.
And Andrew, when you're thinking about this, from a forensic interviewing standpoint, I know you obviously talk about the grooming process and those who are quite honestly victims of the grooming process. Do you also talk about points of resilience?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm sorry, I just want to go back to Stephen's point really quickly.
Yeah, please.
Like you were saying, Stephen, these predators really do fulfill a need that they can sense is there, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the time it's these families who, he really appealed to, like I said, your mom's progressive politics and things like that. And she even, I think in your words said, like, he was a god in her eye, her eyes, right? And with a lot of the families I see, the predator, whether it's mom's boyfriend, stepdad, uncle, teacher, whoever it is, they're always helping out the family in some way. Whether it's with financial help, whether it's, oh, you're a single mom, I will help you. I'll pick up and drop off your child for practice, right? And like the moms, let's just say, are so grateful for that and are so helped. And I think just because they just seem so great, in Stephen's case, a social worker who is a camp counselor,
director,
I think, right? Yeah, and director. Sorry, yeah, and so to even think that thought that this might be nefarious, I think it just goes against most people's thinking. But the important thing is that is the way for them to get access, right, to the child. You have to be willing to give up your child to go on vacation with them or the weekend. So I really think the idea, the fact that families and caregivers get groomed too is huge. And what we do in our forensic interviews is, not just gather, it's a fact-finding interview, but we don't just gather like what happened at the abuse, right? From A to Z. We try to get the sort of the qualitative information, which really is about the grooming, right? Like, how did this happen? When did you first meet? What were some things that you enjoyed about this person? Right. Right? Like, what did your mom say about this person? You know, all those kinds of things surrounding the abuse. And that gives a bigger picture of, oh, this is how it happened. Oh, this is why the child didn't disclose until much later, you know, which we know, right, amongst us and probably people who are watching. But for example, if a case were to ever go to trial, jurors don't know this stuff. So
Right.
it's kind of on forensic interviewers for this, you know, recorded, captured video of the interview to kind of, while we're eliciting that information, we're educating the jury on how this possibly happened. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredibly insightful. And it's interesting too, because when you look at so many of the first person accounts, whether it was by gymnasts or, you know, victims of priests or in scouting, the family, the sense of family that they are indebted to this person for helping them out is such a constant. And the you know, the filter, this rosy glasses that they're looking at this person through, and at the extreme, and of course kids pick up their signal from the parents, right?
Exactly.
And at the extreme, you had Larry Nassar sexually assaulting girls while their mothers were in the room, right? That's how adept he was at playing the moms while assaulting their daughters, with everyone thinking everything was hunky-dory. And what's so, one of the things that really struck me about that was when that whole thing blew up, there was a piece by two gymnast sisters in a newspaper. I think it was The Guardian, but I'm not sure. And it opened with them saying, and this was after Rachel Den Hollander came forward in the Indianapolis News article. They read it and they said, "Oh my God, that's horrible. Thank God that didn't happen to us." And then they looked at each other and they said, "Oh my God, that did happen to us." So that's how good Nassar was, right? But every other abuser is some, you know, variation on that theme.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think it sounds like what you're saying is that, you know, the better you are, the more you can do it in plain sight.
Yes, absolutely.
Knows literally the caregiver is in the room. And then the child then thinks, could that possibly have happened? It must have been okay. Because my
Yeah.
mom, you know, it's
Right.
just so diabolical.
Yeah.
But Caitlin, I'm sorry, I wanted to answer the question. Just
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's so interesting, you know.
the protective factor. Oh, I mean,
Yes.
you know, we talk about this at Darkness to Light. We feel so strongly about this because this is the empowering piece, right? Is
Mhm.
that you absolutely can protect your child. The best way is with your relationship with your child.
Mm-hmm.
You have you're connected to your child. If your child feels connected to you, that they can come to you and talk to you, that you have created an environment, you know, over the years, cumulatively, where you can talk about difficult things. You've talked about child sexual abuse. You've talked about keeping yourself safe. You've talked about people making you feel uncomfortable. You've talked about how your body feels at certain times. The more I think kids feel empowered to listen to their own inner voices and to their bodies, and feel that they're supported by a caregiver, that absolutely is a huge protective factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked a little bit about the fact that your aunt and uncles they were caring, right? But they weren't, it wasn't enough, your relationship wasn't close enough to actually disclose.
I don't think, yeah, those things are absolutely true, but as loving and caring, and I knew they were toward me, and then there was my first cousin who was on the scene. He's a major character in part one of the book and suspected something was wrong.
Yeah.
But you could have put a gun to my head at age 13, 14, 15, and I wouldn't have disclosed, because it was that combination of terror. I thought he'd kill me. And the shame, you know, that Andrea touched on before, you know, my own feeling of complicity. I must have in some way invited this. And of course, abusers put that there. That's part of their whole deal, is to make you feel complicit. And that's a whole separate conversation. And it's especially really diabolical with boys, because, you know, a boy body will respond to any animate or inanimate object. It doesn't matter what. That's just biology at work. And, but, you know, boys don't understand that, but predators do. And they use that against boys to, you know, immediately trigger that shame and guilt and sense of complicity. You know, you want this. Look at your body is responding. You must want it. So, you know, between that and the terror of him, there was no way I was going to disclose. And, you know, I got to say, most of the male survivors I know, and I know many, I can think of very few who would have disclosed under almost any circumstances. So there's a moment in the book where I'm meeting with the FBI in 1987, and when I'm trying to stop Dan Farinella, and the FBI agent says to me, boys who have been abused are tougher to crack than murderers. You know, you try all the tricks and they just won't crack. Mm-hmm. And that was me. I understood that nothing was going to get me to talk about this. So
a nice teaser for the conversation we'll have in part 2 and part 3.
Right.
So I want to go back to that point you made about your cousin suspecting, and can you frame a little bit why did your cousin suspect, and how did you feel when he did suspect, and what kind of came about because he realized?
So I think he was, you know, Andrea was talking before about different personality types, right? I was the very sort of, you know, trusting, sensitive, do anything to please an adult kind of kid. You know, my cousin David, who was like a brother to me growing up after my father died, you know, I spent so much time in his house. He was very much a brother. Very different personality type. He knew how to stand up for himself physically and emotionally. He called out adults on their stuff, and he wasn't taking anything. And he had radar for Farinella early on. There's something off with this guy, and he picked up that Farinella was trying to drive a wedge between us, which is exactly what he was doing, and succeeded in doing. But you know, where it really came to a head, and this says a lot about how sex abusers operate in sort of youth certain camps and other youth serving organizations, and how blatant it is. There's a scene in the book where my cousin walks in on us in Farinella's bedroom right after he'd abused me. So he didn't catch him in the act of assaulting me, but I'm half naked in his bed. Right. So 5 alarms. And that sets off a chain of events that, you know, you'll have to read the book to find out. But basically, you know, at that point, he knows there's something wrong. And Farinella knows, okay, this kid, you know, this 15-year-old wise ass is on to me, and I got to get rid of him. And he goes about getting him out of camp. And at that point, David tells my aunt and uncle, his parents, something's wrong. And his mother actually asks him, do you think Dan Farinella is molesting Stephen? And he didn't really know what to make of that. He couldn't know. And it was obviously beyond his realm. This was not something that was ever discussed, right, when we were kids. And it was not in the realm of our reality, much less having language for it. So the interesting thing about that, and it leads to another point about this whole sort of the ecosystem of enabling, and there's a fantastic law professor, writer named Amos Giora, who wrote Armies of Enablers, who writes about the ecosystem of pedophilia. And I'll give you an example of it right here. My cousin was one of and he was an employee at that time. He was employed as a kitchen worker at the camp. He's one of 3 different employees, and who walked in, actually 4 now that I think about it, because I just learned of another one at a different camp. One of 4 employees at different camps who walked in on Farinella in the middle of sexually assaulting her child or just afterwards, where it was flagrantly obvious what had happened. And yet nothing came of it, right? So this is really part of the enabling issue and the complicity and how it happens inside organizations. When someone is so beloved and so powerful, people refuse to believe their own eyes. It's just too dangerous, right? It's too risky to
As
be willing.
our friend, our collective friend Jim Clemente says, power of the or pillar of the community perpetrator, which
Yes.
I think is,
Yeah,
you know,
because
what
what employee, what parent even is going to step up and say, you know, this person who, you know, we all thought is God's gift to this community is a charlatan and a sex criminal. You know, that is just huge stakes and takes a lot of courage for an individual to call out someone with that much power.
So, Andrea, I know you and I talk about this, but there are very clear steps you should take when you see, you know, red flag behaviors. So, how do you intervene? I think what Stephen's cousin was dealing with, obviously, he's a child himself. There's some social pressure and stigma there. You know, there's some uncertainty, like all those things that people feel when they're put in these situations. How do you collect yourself so that you can actually take the right step?
Yeah, I mean, it's just beyond the capabilities of a child, right? To do that. But as adults, we have a responsibility, and bystander intervention. We talk about naming the behavior, calling it out, naming it, and moving on, right? So, for example, I know, especially around the holidays, but for a lot of families, adult family members expect to hug or kiss a child. And sometimes you can tell the child doesn't want to for whatever reason. And, you know, I know that one of the things that we suggest is saying something like, if if a parent is seeing a child uncomfortable or just doesn't want to, you just say, you know what, so-and-so doesn't, seems like, they might want to give a high five instead. Or in our family, we have the option of high five or a hug, and just kind of naming it and moving on. And I think part of that is you're also letting this person who is crossing a boundary know that you've seen it, you've identified it, you've made a point of it, it's a red flag to you. And you're there and you're going to step in and protect your child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because as we've identified tonight, individuals who are looking to hurt children are boundary breakers. And so if you're calling out those boundary violations, it's, and I like the move on aspect to it. We don't have to dwell on it. I'm not accusing you of anything except, recognizing a child's boundary. That's it. Yeah. So we've talked now about two types, the two sort of audiences for Farinella's grooming, but the third one truly is the organization that he worked for. And Stephen, you talk quite a bit about that. Can you talk to us about what some of those behaviors were, and like, where is it evident that he is literally grooming his organization? I'm sorry, Stephen. I can't hear you. Andrea, can you hear Stephen?
So sorry, I must have hit the mute button.
That's
Am I
okay.
back?
Yep.
Yeah, it's really interesting question, because even as a kid, when I was 13, 14, administrators from the Bronx, YMHA, and UJA, New York, which were, the agencies that ran the camp, would visit camp each summer. And even at that age, I understood that they so revered this guy, and they were his bosses, and they were clearly kowtowing to him. And he was running the show. That's how it felt to me as a kid. And so that was really a lesson right there, right? About how he had, of course, I didn't think about it as a kid, it was only in retrospect, that he had already, I'm sure, and this is true of many sex predators inside youth serving organizations, they have groomed and won over an entire echelon of adults before they ever touch a child. And he certainly did that in these agencies. And then, of course, in the camp setting itself, it was very clear how he won over and intimidated young adult counselors and senior staff who, almost like the kids, had a mix of affection and fear when it came to him. No one wanted to cross him because his anger was volcanic, and you did not want to be on the other side of that, at any point. So there was a lot of fear at work. And, that's what, going back to what I was saying before, you've got someone like that, when they're caught by employees sexually assaulting a child and nothing happens. Well, that's why, because he's already wired the whole situation. And I still have communications with ex-employees of these camps, who to this day have a really hard time understanding that he was using them. It's really tough for them to see that they were enabling this behavior by turning away and not blowing the whistle on it, even anonymously in some way, and this is why having protocols in place and enforcing them is so important, because it's so difficult for any one individual to challenge someone with that kind of power. And very, very often what we were dealing with is someone with that kind of power, whether it's in, a church or a synagogue, whether it's in a camp, or whether it's in a family, which, as Catherine Robb, the head of Child U.S. Advocacy, likes to say, the family is an institution, and there is a power structure, in the family. So this is why having, knowing what to do and doing it is so important.
Well, you're an ambassador for Child USA and a board member of Child USA Advocacy, the organization Catherine runs. And they have Child USA's gold standard. Tell us about that, and if you think it would have made a difference in the organizations and camps that your abuser worked at.
Yeah, the gold standard is very, very interesting, because until, this is back in 2021, Child USA did something that had never been done before, which is to actually go back and look at thousands of cases of child sexual abuse and survey that many victims. This was across athletics, the gymnastics case, church cases, Boy Scouts, and find out from the victims themselves what happened and how it happened, right? So, start with the crime scene, not what we imagine happened, but what actually happened, right, from the victim's experience. And then based on that, because believe it or not, on a lot of those institutions, there were supposedly safeguards in place. Well, clearly they failed. So based on that, Child USA came up with a set of protocols called the Gold Standard, which includes, you won't be surprised, things like background screening and prevention training, which, Darkness to Light does so fantastically. But then it goes on to talk about, the vital importance of not just recognizing red flag behaviors, but being sure that there are procedures in place to be sure they're acted on. What happens when an employee reports? Are whistleblowers protected? Is there a person designated to take that report? How is the risk assessment conducted, right? When someone points the finger at an adult as carrying out a red flag behavior, how do they assess that risk? And if abuse has occurred, how quickly is it reported to the authorities, right? So these are the kinds of questions that the gold standard protocols recommend are designed to ensure that they're in place. But lastly, and most importantly, I think the real innovation is that they're enforceable. And the way that they're enforceable is Child USA is starting to partner with insurance companies, because insurers are really one of the big underutilized powers here, right? They have a lot at stake. They're often caught holding the bag monetarily in these, in claims cases. And the role of insurers in the gold standard is to not only make sure that a youth servant organization adopts stringent child protection policies, but that they're audited on a regular basis to be sure that they're actually enforcing them. And the reason that's so important is we keep seeing over and over again, I'm not going to take our time getting into them, but there were so many recent cases where we've had youth serving organizations, camps and otherwise, who supposedly had really good child protection policies in place and training, and completely failed at the first report by a child of having been sexually assaulted in that situation. And because we know how hard it is to change human behavior, right? Because of all the things we talked about. You can have the best policies in the world on your bulletin board, but if everyone inside an organization hasn't been trained over and over and over and knows they're going to be supported if they report anonymously or not, knows that victims will be supported, knows the authority will be notified if there was abuse, right? Every employee has to know with 100% certainty this is the case. Yeah. Not that there's some gray area where I may be risking my job. If that's what your employees are thinking, you've got a big problem.
Yeah, it's why we agree. And it's why at Darkness to Light, we spent the last 5 years building our theory of change that's totally based on behavior change and barriers to entry for that behavior change.
Right.
And so then we built our consulting services that do a lot of what you've just talked about: policies and procedures, environmental scans, trainings, customized ongoing consulting for culture. Because those policies and procedures are only as good as the culture, as you just pointed out, in which they exist, right?
Yep.
And so whether they're saved in a folder in your desktop or implemented is really about whether or not you have a culture of leadership to be able to bring that over the finish line.
I'm so thrilled to hear that, really. I mean, that is just fantastic work and so important, and is just so it's a huge missing piece. From all the survivors I speak to, that is just such a big missing piece. How to change the culture, in places.
We have about 6 minutes left, and so we have some great questions. I'm just going to take 2 of the few questions that we have. And so I wanted, one question, Stephen, goes back to language, which I think is so appropriate because you wrote such a beautiful book. But it says, Stephen, we didn't have the language to describe sexual abuse in the 60s and 70s. When did you realize it was abuse? And this person is saying, I had to hear someone else's story on Oprah at the age of 16 to realize that what was done to me was actually wrong.
Yeah, ditto. That is so common amongst survivors. And I didn't realize until I was 23 years old and saw the perpetrator, Dan Farinella, take a boy who looked just like me at age 13 into a cabin by himself. And it was like I was struck by lightning. I instantly knew what he was doing, I instantly understood what had happened to me, which I had never allowed myself to put together because I didn't have the language. And, unfortunately, I also in a flash understood the extent of the damage he must have done to so many boys,
The other question, Stephen, and again, they're really great questions, so I'm so sorry if it's not yours. But this individual is looking to hear about the correlation between your father's death and how that made you a target. Clearly being the quieter kid made you a target, but did he also target more nuclear family kids? So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So, it's dangerous to generalize too much, right? Because there are as many, when it comes to this sort of predator personalities, there are people who, spend entire careers and write, books about these things. And they're all different. All we know is that they'll always take on the cloak and the culture of whatever culture they're working in, whether it's, whether they're in the church or the scouts or, a teacher, they know how to camouflage themselves within that culture. But as to their preferences, that, in terms of the children they're targeting, that's much more complex, right? And goes to the pathology of what their compulsions are. So it's really hard to generalize there. In this specific case, we had a guy who was definitely targeting boys who were either fatherless or from troubled families. And I only know that because, as I said before, I tracked down many other victims, and this was almost always true, not 100%, but almost always true, that they were very similar to me in that way. So clearly for him, he had some kind of, really twisted father complex thing going on, right? That got worked out through, putting himself forward as a protector of, fatherless boys, and knowing how to manipulate and abuse them. So I just happened to, that was my bad fortune, not only to, lose a father as a child, which was, of course, traumatizing in and of itself, but to then have that leveraged by, this sociopath into to satisfy his own twisted needs, right? That lined up. And as we said before, as I said, he was so systematic about this. At a certain point, when I started tracking down survivors, I literally began asking old friends from camp, okay, who do we know who didn't have a father? And I'd call that person. It was bingo. It wasn't complicated, right? That connection.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that. Knowing that we only have a minute left, I'm going to push us a couple minutes. I want to give each of you one last opportunity to say something that's on your mind. I know we had a lot of questions that we had discussed, and so Andrea, I'll have you go first.
Well, I just want to say that to those of you who haven't read Stephen's book, you have to read it. You won't put it down until you are done in like one sitting. I found myself, when I talk about what happened and what he wrote, I refer to it like it's a movie. I'm like, and then in that scene, this happened. And then this, I can see it in my mind because he's such an excellent writer. So I encourage you all to read that. And then the other thing I wanted to say was, as Stephen has mentioned, and what I see in my work, kids are so keenly aware of how little power they have. They know this. They get that message every single day of their lives. They hardly ever have choices in what they have to do, and they know that. Some families explicitly say, you have to do what adults say, right? No matter what. And so often I'll have kids say, well, I didn't know I could. He was an adult. He said I had to do this, or he just did this, so I just went along with it. And I guess I just wish, my final message is a wish that adults and parents think about that for a second from a kid's perspective and try to empower them, to let them know that they have control over what happens to their bodies, and that they have, control in the sense of being able to speak up when they think something isn't right, because that's also a skill to practice, right? Being in touch with yourself and speaking up, and at least within the confines of a safe relationship with a caregiver, right? And we know you'll really only need one in your life. If kids were sort of given that empowerment, I think we could protect more kids.
So beautiful. And for those of you who want to hear more from Andrea, because there were some questions for Andrea as well, she is going to be in the new Stewards of Children that Darkness to Light is releasing in April of 2023. So if you have taken Stewards, you're definitely going to want to take it again with all new experts and all new survivors. Stephen, last word?
Yeah, well, Andrea, that was so beautifully said. And, it really, that issue, and we didn't talk about it a whole lot, but it goes back a little bit to what I was saying at the beginning about the way we push this issue away. And, one key cause of that is just this puritanical culture we live in, right? And all this ambivalence about bodies and sexuality. Which is just to say that, from a parenting standpoint, the more that kids are taught from, the toddler years, to be at home and safe and comfortable and knowing in their own bodies, then the more embodied and self-protective, and they're going to be later. It just makes total sense. But because most of us were raised under a very different culture and situation, have such a hard time with that. And it's very much, in my experience, part of the reason that folks have such a hard time looking at this issue, much less taking action on it, because it makes them so uncomfortable. And who wants to go into discomfort? No one does, right? But I really believe, and I see, kids who are made to feel as comfortable and casual about knowing their body and naming their body parts as they are about stopping before they cross the street and looking both ways. It's not a big deal. We think it's a big deal because we have such charged stuff around it, but it's really not, and it's quite natural and serves kids in a huge way, down the road.
100%. I just want to remind everyone, you do have 2 free resources. If you feel like you want to talk to someone after this conversation, you can call toll-free 1-866-4-LIGHT. That's FORLIGHT. Or you can text the word light to 741-741. I just want to thank you both for such an amazing conversation. I know we've been planning for a while. We're so excited. Andrea, thank you for joining us tonight. For those of you who are interested, part 2 and part 3 are happening February 21st and March 21st, and we will have Stephen back to talk about part 2 and part 3 of his book, along with new experts. So if you have not yet read or purchased Stephen's book, Chosen, please do so at an independent bookstore. And this is what it looks like. It's amazing, Chosen. And just make sure that you sign up for part 2 and part 3. And thank you so much, Stephen and Andrea, for your chat. Great conversation.
Thanks for having us, Caitlin.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Have a great evening.
You too.
Bye-bye.